Here is our DIY proofing box, which also doubles as a functional piece of furniture. Normally I design all of my projects with pen and paper, but this time I worked it out on the computer so I could get the most out of a 4x8 sheet of plywood. I also wanted a removable lid that could act like a serving tray, so I wanted to make sure that all of my dimensions were going to be right. The proofing box is designed to hold 4 12-inch bowls, 2 at the bottom and 2 on a shelf that's not shown in this drawing yet. Jumping ahead, here is the completed proofing box, which turned out quite well. This automatic heat control system can set the heater from about 60 degrees all the way to 108 degrees. The actual heat is delivered by this heat mat, which is a standard off-the-shelf item used for either aquariums or for starting seeds. The heater only uses 8 watts and it comes on just for a few minutes every hour, so the design is very efficient and the entire box is insulated. Okay, so here are a few videos showing the build process for this proofing box. I wanted this to be a nice piece of furniture, so I used good one-side birch plywood. If you just want to build a basic proofing box, you could use standard plywood as well. I had the lumberyard cut the main pieces for me because it only cost a few dollars and they're very accurate. Here we are in the shop checking to make sure all the pieces fit together. The box goes together so the ugly edges of the plywood are at the back side, and I will be using small finishing nails and glue on the sides here so you don't see them when it's completed. The lumberyard did a good job cutting, all the pieces fit together, and the design hides the underside of the veneer that was chipped by the saw. This is something that can't be avoided when you're cutting thin veneer plywood. It probably took more effort to design this to hide bad edges and splinters than it did to design the actual box. If you just want to design a basic proofing box that's going to be out of sight, then you can use standard plywood, not really worry about the edges or the good sides. So once I checked all the measurements and did a test fitting, I labeled the top, bottom, and sides, and I added an arrow to point towards the best side. The goal is to cover all the edges with trim and hide all of the nail and screw holes. I should mention that I am not a carpenter, just an amateur builder with a basic set of tools. Here I'm pre-drilling holes for the finishing nails. The finishing nails will just hold the pieces together while the glue sets. If I was building a basic proofing box for the back room out of standard plywood, I would just put everything together with screws. I will be writing this up as a more detailed plan and will explain why you want to pre-drill and how to avoid having the wood split when you nail it together. I used a construction adhesive on the edges to hold everything together. The finishing nails just set the wood in place and the construction adhesive dries in a few hours, making a very strong box. This stuff is extremely strong and I use it for a lot of projects. I even used it to glue the bricks behind our wood stove, and it's been on for 10 years and not one brick has ever come off. The glue starts to set in about 15 minutes, so you have plenty of time to align everything and make sure everything's all set up before driving in any nails. After about an hour, there's no going back. If you tried to separate the box, you would break the wood before you'd break the glue bond. Once the pieces were aligned, I drove the finishing nails just to the surface of the wood for now, and once the glue has set, the finishing nails will be driven below the surface, and then the holes will be covered up with some wood putty. When the proofing box is completed, there will be no visible signs of any nails. Here are the 5 pieces that make up the basic box, held together by the finishing nails so that the glue can set overnight. Everything looks square and the temperature in the shop is 65 degrees, which is warm enough according to the manufacturer's instructions. Jumping ahead a bit, here's the oak trim for the front of the box. This will also hold the hinges for the front door. The trim has been glued to the edge of the plywood, and the finishing nails are once again just used to hold everything in place while the glue can set overnight. This design is much like a standard cupboard, and I will be using the same hinges from a cupboard as well. On that note, you could probably make a quick and easy proofing box by just using a small kitchen cupboard and adding some insulation to it. But around here, building it is half the fun. To help regulate the heat and make the heating system more efficient, I lined the entire box with 1/2-inch rigid foam. You can purchase this insulating foam at just about any hardware store, and it's really easy to cut and work with. I did some initial testing with the heating pad without using the foam, and it really made a huge difference when the foam was installed into the box. The heater only came on about 1/4 of the time compared to no foam at all. Here is the removable top lid, which is also a serving tray. The trim has already been glued to the wood, and I will go over this in a lot more detail in the actual DIY plan that I will be writing soon. As I mentioned, I am not a carpenter. I normally work with metal, but some of my metalworking tools find a use when I do carpentry. This is a handheld angle grinder, and I'm using a flap disc to take the edges off the front of the trim. It really works quick, and it makes a nice smooth edge with little effort. Of course, I will finish up everything using a hand sanding block once the wood filler's all installed, and the entire box will be sliver free and nice and smooth on all corners. Once all the trim is installed and the glue has set, all of the finishing nails are pushed just below the surface and all cracks are filled in with wood putty. A final hand sanding is done to smooth up all the edges, and then the entire box will be covered with shellac. Here is the back side of the front door showing the standard cupboard hinges installed. These hinges are great because you don't see them from the front, and they're easy to adjust with these 2 small screws for a perfect fitting door. I also added these little caster wheels that I found at the hardware store so we could easily move the box around the living room. And my helper Jake thinks everything's coming along nicely. Here's a close-up of the sanding disc I used to round off all the corners. It's basically a disc with flaps of sandpaper, and it spins at 10,000 RPM. An adjustable vent was also added to the back of the box. I'm not sure if we will need an adjustable moisture vent yet, but I'd rather add it now than later. It's a lot harder to make adjustments once the finishing touches are on. I used some leftover plywood to make this simple trapdoor system for the back of the box. At this point, the proofing box is almost completed. I added the last bit of insulating foam to the front of the door, and the clamps are holding it in place while the glue sets. Here is the completed proofing box before any of the heating hardware was installed. The shellac has just dried and everything looks good. This clear plexiglass insert was added to help trap the heat if you like to open the door and check on things every once in a while. And around the back of the box, we have the adjustable vent that can be used to let moisture out. Venting will be determined by the type of bread, and we haven't done enough to really know if we're going to need it yet. But it's always better to think ahead when you're building something. The proofing box is now ready to have the heating hardware installed. Heating hardware is something I will go into a lot more detail in the final plan. I found quite a few DIY proofing boxes that just used light bulbs for the heat source. This is fine if you don't mind doing some electrical, but I found these heat mats were perfect and they plug right in without having to do any wiring whatsoever. The heating mat plugs directly into the little control box, and all you have to do is set the temperature and it takes care of the rest automatically. The temperature control box comes with a small probe that sits inside the box, and this monitors the temperature. You can purchase these heating mats and control boxes for under $100. Just search for seating mats or reptile heaters because they are exactly the same thing. I tried several sizes of heating mats, and the smaller one, the 10x20, was more than enough. In my research, I found that 80 degrees was probably a good temperature to shoot for, and this 8-watt mat could do it easily. In fact, I could get the temperature up to 100 degrees if I wanted to. So the remaining step is to just tidy up all the wiring. Here is the completed DIY proofing box. Not too bad for a couple days of work using just basic tools. I drilled a hole through the back and added the temperature probe inside the box, and then mounted the heat controller to the side so it could be easily adjusted. Excess wiring is tied up neatly at the back, and there's just a single plug to plug into any AC outlet. Time to make some bread. Well, I completed the box 3 days ago, but I realize it takes quite a few days to get your starter going properly. But on the bright side, the starter is exactly where it should be. It started off as nothing but a flat pancake, and now it's grown about 3 times in size, and it's bubbling nicely. I've been keeping the temperature in the box at about 73 degrees and adding flour to the mixture once or twice a day. I also didn't have time to add the center shelf yet, so we will do a follow-up and I will show how my bread turned out and show how I built the removable center shelf. So that's it for now. If you want to ask some questions on the bread box, feel free, or if you want to share some ideas on how to make better bread, that would be great. Jake, want some bread?